Hi, today I want to talk about the ego and what happens to our ego while we're inside of the toxic system and what happens when we leave the toxic system and begin to heal. So first, let's talk about what the ego is. A healthy ego is necessary for survival. Your ego is what makes you brush your teeth, eat healthy food, work out. It's concerned with your physical survival. An unhealthy ego is concerned with what other people think. Do I have more money than the person next to me? Am I making enough money to have this big fancy car? Am I the prettiest woman in the room? And if I'm not, what can I do to be the prettiest woman in the room? Or how can I make the prettiest woman in the room not feel like she's pretty? That's unhealthy ego. So when you're in a toxic system, especially if it's one that you were born into. However, I think that if you're in a toxic relationship, chances are you were probably born into a toxic system, because we go with what we're familiar with. We make these emotional maps when we're young. People who come from healthy systems can end up in abusive relationships, but not always. I think pretty much if you're from an unhealthy system, there's a very, very good chance that until you process everything and learn to reprogram yourself, you're going to have unhealthy relationships. So when you're in the system, your ego is destroyed in a negative way. Destroying the ego in a positive way is letting go of attachments, particularly attachments to outcomes. Do I have enough to be able to put food on the table, live in a safe neighborhood? That's healthy. And not to say that there's anything wrong with being rich. There's not. But if you're pursuing it and that's all that you're pursuing in life is money and power, then you're letting your ego rule you, and you're probably going to be pretty abusive to people and predatory. So when you're in the system, your ego is destroyed, but rather than being destroyed in a healthy manner where you're releasing attachments to all of these things that I just mentioned, it's destroyed in favor of feeding the ego of the toxic people within the system. So, for example, I'll just use an example from my life. I've been divorced for about 10 years, and my ex-husband was pretty abusive, imagine that. But I couldn't get a glass of water without him having something to say about it. If I was thirsty and I went and got a glass of water and he realized that I had gone and gotten a glass of water and not asked him if he wanted one, it didn't matter if we were sitting together or if he was in another room. If he was home, I was expected to cater to his physical needs, even as I catered to mine. And I was not allowed to cater to my physical needs without also catering to his. There was nothing that was just Carson taking care of Carson. And that's a very small example, but that is the kind of thing that you face. And I'm sure if you're watching this video and you've been in a system like that, you know that. You aren't allowed to think about, what do I want? What you want a lot of times is your ego. But again, it's not necessarily unhealthy. I wanted to study theater. I couldn't because, well, reasons, toxic system reasons. I could have. I can't say that I couldn't. But I will say that I was discouraged and mocked enough that I didn't. I felt stupid for wanting to pursue it. And now I'm friends with Broadway stars, so that's kind of a nice feeling, which is my ego talking, but it's okay. It's nice to, when you're mocked for wanting something and told that you would never be good enough, to have someone who is an actor on Broadway take you under his wing and become your mentor, and tell you that they were wrong and you should have and could have pursued it. Feels really good. He also said Broadway's cutthroat and people on Broadway can be snobby. So he acknowledged that there were two sides to that. In case he ever sees this video, I don't want him thinking that I'm cherry picking his statements. So anyway, so, that was something that I wanted. Well, that was my ego. But of course, you have to have an ego to have some sort of any kind of professional drive, right? But again, then you go back to money gives stability, and stability gives us the ability to not be dependent on other people, so then it goes back to healthy ego. But yeah, I mean, you're not really, nothing that you do is really for you and for yourself. Even if you're physically taking care of yourself, it's only the most basic ego function. It's just, it is the most basic, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself. It is the most basic ego function when you're literally only making sure that you have enough food to survive, and you can't be concerned with anything else because you're constantly under, some sort of attack. Because narcissistic abuse attacks your ego and your existence, and that can either be literal with physical abuse, or it can be more existential gaslighting, being taught to not trust your instincts, finding yourself constantly in bad situations because you've been taught not to trust your instincts. So when you get out of the system, you kind of have to balance things out. And if you've spent your entire life, because if you're in an abusive marriage, you probably came from an unhealthy family, because otherwise how would you have ended up in an abusive marriage? I mean, it can happen. I'm not saying that it can't, but generally speaking, if you end up in a marriage that's unhealthy, you probably have an unhealthy emotional map from when you were a kid. I hope I'm not repeating myself too much. I've had to restart this video several times, and I'm having a hard time remembering what I said during my first two takes. So when you leave, you kind of have to, you don't know how to set up healthy ego boundaries. I remember, and I put this on my Instagram, which I have an Instagram. After I left my ex-husband, I was in the car with a friend of mine and her mother, and I've known them since I was 14. Her mother passed last year, which is sad because she was like a mother to me. But anyway, we were in the car and I said something, and I don't even remember what I said, but she said, "Carson, you're being a real bitch." And I was like, because she never talked to me like that. Like, she wasn't the type of person to say that. So I just kind of looked at her, and she looked at me and she said, "It's okay. You're just getting over having your boundaries violated." It was something along the lines of, I remember her smiling at me just like that and saying, "It's okay." She said, "You're getting over having your boundaries violated and not having your needs taken care of. And this is necessary in order for you to balance out later. You have to be a bitch right now." And she's right. I went through it when I left my ex-husband, and then I went through it again 2 years ago when I finally got out of the toxic systems that I was stuck in. That's something that I beat myself up for, and I don't want anybody else to beat themselves up for, because it is necessary. And you don't know how to set healthy boundaries because no one's ever listened to you before. So when you start setting them, it's like anything else. It's like working out. You know, when you work out, you're flexing these muscles that you've never used before, and you're probably going to injure yourself at some point because you're going to overextend yourself because you don't quite know, what your limits are. And it's very much the same when you get out of a toxic system. You're flexing muscles that you've never used before. You're setting boundaries. You're doing something that you're not used to doing. And sometimes you're going to be a real ass. And it's not okay to just walk around and be a real ass. But you're going to do it because you're having to teach yourself and learn things that you should have learned a long time ago, but you weren't allowed to learn them because you were stuck in this narcissistic system that scapegoated you and made you cater to the people in the system rather than yourself. I want people to know that that's normal, because I spent a lot of time beating myself up. And every time I did, I would try to remember what Mariette said about you're being a real bitch, but it's okay. It's necessary for your psychological development. She was a psychiatric nurse, by the way. Apologize when you need to. Learn a lesson. Don't just go around. I mean, if you go around and you're acting like that and it's, well, I was in this system and that's why I acted like that. Well, that's really not okay. Because that's just excusing your behavior and kind of doing the exact same thing that the people in the system did. But it is okay to say, look, I did that because I was in this toxic system and I didn't learn how to set boundaries and how to take care of myself. And so sometimes I go overboard, and I'm really sorry. And I'm going to learn something from this and try not to do it again. That's what I would tell you to say to someone if you happen to overstep and do that with them. Someone who obviously is not abusive or in the toxic system. Because you're going to have moments with people who are perfectly fine, healthy individuals who care about you, who are, your friends, or maybe even, someone in your family, if you remain in contact with someone in your family. Forgive yourself and learn from it. Don't excuse it, but do acknowledge the reasons so that you can fix it. Because if you sit around and you criticize yourself and, oh God, I can't believe that I said that. Oh, you're doing the exact same thing that the toxic system trained you to do. Which is be so critical of yourself. And I cannot remember who said this to me. It's been a really long time since someone said this to me. I believe it might have actually been someone in one of the toxic systems that I was in. because even a stopped clock is right twice a day. The toxic system trains you to be critical of yourself and beat yourself up. When you're that hard on yourself and you're going back to what that system tried to train you, or what they did train you to do, you know, what makes you, here's what they said. If you're sitting around and being critical of yourself because when you left this toxic system, you had all these, and that's the other issue, is you have all these unprocessed emotions. And, you know, in my case, it was emotions that were 2 decades old that I had not been allowed to feel. I was told that I was bad for grieving my son being adopted out to these 2 people by force. It was perfectly natural for me to grieve. And the fact that I wasn't allowed to grieve made me internalize it and really affected my mental health. So you've got all this stuff, and you're struggling with it. And when you beat yourself up like that, what you're saying is, I'm so especially bad that I deserve to have a constant inner critical dialogue and to constantly beat myself up. Well, that's unhealthy ego. You know, if you were really that bad, then you would probably be a psychopath, in which case you definitely wouldn't be sitting around agonizing over it. And so when you do that, you're just kind of setting yourself up to, you know, instead of getting wrapped up in your ego in, oh, I'm so good, you're wrapped up in your ego of, oh, I'm so bad. So just forgive yourself. I wish that I had figured this out a lot sooner than I did, because I think that my recovery would have been a lot quicker and easier. So I hope that somebody else can learn from my mistake. You're going to go through this, and I would say that it would last a minimum of a year, maybe 2. For me, I've been out of the system for the toxic systems for about 2 years. I would say it took me a full year to process all of the righteous anger that I had, and the grief. Well, I'm still processing the grief, because you don't ever get over some things, but you can process them and move forward. But it took me about a year before, and part of the reason why was because I would have these rages, because, you know, for 20 years, for longer than that, but for 20 years since all this stuff happened with my son, I had to bottle it down and bottle it down. Well, it's perfectly natural for that to come out and for me to fly into these rages. And is it good? No. Is it okay to take it out on other people? No. I'm sure that there were times that I did that, and I have apologized and made amends when I felt that it was necessary. But I think that if I had, after flying into those rages, instead of being like, oh, why am I doing this? I think if I'd just been like, oh man, I lost control again. Well, you know, I'm still processing these emotions, and what can I learn from this? That's going to get you a lot further than, oh my God, I lost my temper and I flew into a rage, and oh God, I can't believe that I'm doing all that, and maybe they were right, and maybe it's completely self-defeating, and you might as well have stayed in the system as far as your thought processes are concerned, because you're still allowing them to tell you how to feel about yourself. So once you get over processing those emotions, then you can really start working on letting go of your attachments. I I've found a lot more peace in the last 6 months. I'd say it took me about a year and a half before I could really have some perspective. So that's it. I guess that was a 20-minute way of saying be kind to yourself in your recovery journey. Don't be critical of yourself. Do not do the toxic system's job for it and feed into all of this negativity that you've been told. All right, well, thank you for watching my admittedly much longer than I meant for it to be video, and I look forward to seeing you next time.